You always are nervous when you put all the work into building a wall. Fire service, part of the BLM, and I work in Alaska, obviously.
Deep in the frozen heart of Alaska, where the land stretches endlessly beneath snow and silence, a small trapline hut sits alone in a remote valley. Built by hand, reinforced against brutal winters, and trusted with one man's life year after year, this cabin once represented survival, discipline, and independence. Today, it represents something else entirely. Something unanswered. Something heartbreaking. For weeks, no one had heard from Marty Meierotto. That alone was unusual, but not unheard of. Marty was a man who disappeared into the wilderness by choice. Months of silence were part of his rhythm, yet this time felt different. The radios stayed quiet. No sightings, no movement along his trapline. And slowly, unease began to settle among the small circle of trappers who knew him best. What they would eventually find inside Marty Meierotto's trapline hut would leave them shaken, silent, and unwilling to return. And the wilderness, once again, would refuse to explain itself. Alaska does not forgive mistakes. The terrain Marty lived in was not simply remote, it was punishing. Winter temperatures plunged well below zero. Snow buried trails within hours. A single miscalculation could mean death long before help ever arrived. Yet Marty Meierotto chose this life again and again. He didn't just survive there, he mastered it. His trapline hut sat miles from the nearest road, reachable only by snowmobile, sled, or on foot. There were no neighbors, no backup plans. Just one man, his routines, and the land. When fellow trappers noticed that Marty hadn't checked in, hadn't left signs along his line, hadn't appeared where he always did, it triggered concern that was quiet at first. No one wanted to jump to conclusions. Marty had earned a reputation for independence. Still, something felt off. Weeks passed. Then, two experienced trappers made a decision that would change everything. The trip to Marty's trapline hut was long and unforgiving. The snow was deep. Visibility was poor. The valley felt heavier than usual, as if it were holding its breath. Both men had traveled similar routes countless times before, but this time the silence felt different. When they finally reached the cabin, it stood exactly where it always had. Still standing, still intact, but wrong. The snow around the hut was undisturbed. No fresh tracks, no sign of Marty's snowmobile, no marks where gear had been dragged in or out. For a man who was constantly moving, checking traps, maintaining equipment, this absence was alarming. Then they noticed the door. It was slightly open. Not wide, just enough. Marty Meierotto was meticulous, orderly. He did not leave doors open, not in this environment, not ever. An open door in Alaskan winter isn't forgetfulness, it's danger. The trappers paused. They didn't rush inside. They listened. Nothing. No wind inside the cabin. No sound of movement. Just stillness. That was the moment they knew something was wrong. The moment they stepped inside, the temperature hit them first. The stove was cold. That alone told a story. Marty kept that stove running religiously. Letting it die meant risking frozen pipes, damaged supplies, and dangerous conditions. A cold stove meant the cabin had been abandoned longer than expected. Then their eyes adjusted. The cabin was in disarray. This was not how Marty lived. The table was overturned. Gear lay scattered across the floor. Tools were out of place. Items that should have been stored neatly were thrown aside, as if someone had been searching or leaving in a hurry. Marty's coat was gone. So was his rifle. Those two items never left his side, not even inside the cabin, not even to sleep. On the table sat a metal mug, frozen solid, half filled with water. It hadn't been touched in days, maybe longer. The trappers didn't need to say anything to each other. They both understood the same thing at the same time. This wasn't normal. This wasn't planned. Something had interrupted Marty's routine violently enough to leave chaos behind. To understand why the scene was so disturbing, you have to understand Marty Meierotto. Marty lived by systems. Everything had a place. Every task followed a pattern. Survival in Alaska isn't about strength. It's about discipline. Marty had that discipline in abundance. He prepared for emergencies. He planned for delays. He accounted for weather. A man like Marty didn't leave a cabin like this unless something forced him to. The trappers moved carefully through the space. They checked storage areas. They looked for notes, signs, anything. And there was nothing. No explanation, no goodbye, just absence. And the longer they stayed, the heavier the air felt. Near the back of the cabin, one of the trappers stopped. At first, he didn't speak. He just froze. The other man followed his gaze. What they saw is something neither of them has fully described since. Only that it was enough. Enough to silence them. Enough to send fear through men who had spent their lives facing death without hesitation. Enough that they didn't finish searching. They backed away slowly. Then they left. Whatever they encountered in that cabin crossed a line, one that neither man was willing to step over again. Their radio transmission was short, carefully chosen. We found something terrible inside Marty Meierotto's trapline hut. That was all, but it was enough. The message spread quickly through nearby camps and trapping circles. Men who had endured avalanches, bear encounters, and years of isolation felt something new creeping in. Unease, fear, questions no one wanted to answer out loud. What could drive two seasoned trappers away from a cabin without finishing a search? What could silence men who had seen everything? Plans were made to return, then canceled. The two men refused to go back. No amount of reasoning changed their minds. Each admitted privately that something inside them had reached its limit. Others considered going, but hesitated. The terrain was dangerous. The weather unforgiving. And the cabin? The cabin had changed. It was no longer a shelter. It was a warning. Before any organized return could happen, heavy snowfall moved in. Trails disappeared. Tracks vanished. The valley swallowed the hut whole. From the outside, it looked peaceful again. But the silence only made the mystery louder. Why had Marty disappeared? Why was his cabin left like that? And what was found inside? Something so disturbing it drove men away without words? The answers didn't come. And the forest didn't speak. To understand why this discovery hit so deeply, you have to understand the man behind the cabin. Marty Meierotto wasn't reckless. He wasn't careless. He wasn't inexperienced. Every winter, he vanished into total isolation by choice. He lived alone in a primitive, one-room log cabin, hundreds of miles from civilization. He survived where most people wouldn't last a week. He thrived on solitude. He trusted routines, and he respected the wilderness more than anyone. For a man like Marty to disappear without explanation and leave behind a scene so deeply wrong meant something had gone terribly off course. And that realization is what truly broke the hearts of those who knew him. The disappearance of Marty Meierotto didn't just leave an empty cabin behind. It left a hole in a community that understood how fragile life in the wilderness truly is. For people who live by the land, mysteries are rare, but when they happen, they cut deeper than most can imagine. Because men like Marty don't simply vanish. Marty Meierotto wasn't drawn to Alaska for adventure or thrill. He came for discipline, for control, for a life where survival depended entirely on preparation, patience, and respect for nature's rules. Every winter followed a pattern. Marty would arrive before the worst of the cold set in. He'd stock supplies, repair his cabin, and lay out his trapline with exacting care. His days were structured. Morning checks, equipment maintenance, firewood, weather observations. Nights spent documenting conditions and planning ahead. This wasn't a man who left things unfinished. He was known for redundancy, backup plans for backup plans, extra fuel, emergency rations, alternate routes. His gear was always ready, his body conditioned, his mind calm. That's what made his disappearance different. Not alarming at first, but impossible to ignore. Marty had gone quiet before. Everyone knew that. Silence, in his case, usually meant things were going exactly as planned. But this time, the signs didn't line up. Traps weren't being reset. Markers along the trail weren't adjusted. No smoke sightings, no movement. Those details matter to people who live out there. The land tells a story if you know how to read it, and Marty's story had suddenly stopped mid-sentence. The cabin scene confirmed what many had begun to fear. Whatever happened wasn't gradual. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't something Marty chose. What truly unsettled the community wasn't just what was found inside the cabin. It was what wasn't shared afterward. The two trappers who made the discovery didn't embellish. They didn't speculate. They didn't spread rumors. They simply stopped talking. In a world where men recount near-death experiences like weather reports, silence speaks louder than words. People noticed the change in them. The way they avoided questions. The way they shut down conversations. The way they refused to return, even when offered help. That told everyone enough. In isolated places, theories grow quickly. Some whispered about accidents. Others mentioned wildlife encounters. A few wondered about health emergencies. All were possible. None explained everything. If Marty had been injured, why leave without his coat? If it was an animal encounter, where were the signs outside? If he left intentionally, why abandon his cabin in chaos? Every explanation fell apart under scrutiny. And that uncertainty weighed heavily on those who respected Marty most. The men who live this life understand risk better than anyone. They accept that death is part of the equation. But what they struggle with is unanswered endings. Marty wasn't just another trapper. He was steady, reliable. Someone younger men looked up to, not for bravado, but for calm competence. His absence created a quiet fear. If someone as prepared as Marty could disappear without warning, then no one was truly immune. That realization lingered long after the snow settled. As weeks turned into months, the decision not to return to the cabin hardened, not because of superstition, but respect. In the wilderness, there's an unspoken rule. When a place carries too much unanswered weight, you don't disturb it without reason. Marty's cabin had become one of those places. It wasn't abandoned. It was paused in time, a moment left unfinished. Searches in Alaska don't always bring answers. Weather erases evidence. Animals move what humans leave behind. Time rewrites every story. Sometimes the land keeps what it takes. And in Marty's case, the wilderness remains silent. No confirmation, no explanation. Just a cabin standing alone under layers of snow. What makes this story heartbreaking isn't fear. It's respect. Respect for a man who lived honestly, who followed rules the land demanded, who prepared for every known danger, and still vanished. The cabin wasn't just a structure. It was a reflection of Marty's life. Seeing it disrupted meant seeing something deeply personal undone. That's why those who found it couldn't return. Some endings aren't meant to be witnessed twice. Despite the unanswered questions, Marty Meierotto's legacy remains intact. He lived the life he chose. He respected the wilderness. He showed that survival isn't about domination, but balance. And while the mystery of his final days may never be resolved, his impact on those who knew him continues quietly, like the land he loved. Somewhere deep in Alaska, beneath snow and silence, Marty Meierotto's trapline hut still stands. The door may be closed now, the stove cold, the trail erased, but the story hasn't ended. It's simply unfinished. And perhaps that's the way the wilderness prefers it.